want to start by saying that whenever I come back to UCSC, I'm coming home because I finished my undergraduate degree here in 1987. When I first started here, I still would go home every other weekend. And probably about the second quarter I was here, I would go home, and my sister once told me, she goes, you know, every time you come home, you smell like the redwoods. And I really liked that I was here and I got to go home and I smelled like the redwoods. And so as my studies progressed, I decided that I was going to major in history. I knew that, and American studies, and that my focus would be Native American studies. And I worked with Phyllis Rogers, who actually left this, I believe, the year after I left. But I asked her if I could do an independent study on California Indians, and she said absolutely, absolutely. So we set it up, and every other week I would meet with her. And about halfway through the quarter, I went in, and she had assigned me the Indian history of the Modoc War. And I walked in and I sat down and I said, okay, Phyllis, let's talk. And she goes, oh, Rebecca, it's the first thing she said to me when I sat down. Oh, Rebecca, I wish you would have chosen any other topic rather than California Indians. And I said, why, Phyllis? And she said, because the history is so painful. It's so painful. And I started thinking, because we were halfway through the quarter, I started thinking, you know, she's right. And on that day, I decided I'm not going to focus on California Indians. And so I went to graduate school, and I didn't focus on California Indians. I went to the University of Colorado Boulder. Actually, the Native American historian came to California for a couple of years while I was at Colorado. So I had to kind of do Western history rather than Indian history, but I focused on Indian. It's kind of a long story. I'm not going to get into that one. But I had to read for my oral comprehension examinations Al Hurtado's Indian Survival on the California Frontier. And it had just come out, and I started reading that. And I started thinking, I was looking at this all wrong. I was looking at this all wrong. Yes, it's a painful history. It's a hard history. It's a difficult history. But what caught my eye first with Hurtado's book was the word survival. Survival. And so I did my comprehension exams. I did what I needed to do, and I decided Colorado wasn't for me because I couldn't focus on Native Americans. They didn't have anybody there. So I went to the Arizona State University and I actually worked with Al Hurtado. And I really just learned a lot just from this idea of survival. So today, I want to address the dynamic and changing nature of Native women's lives in California as they experienced hardship and as they rebuilt lives and futures. These experiences were a direct result of contact with non-Indians and the effects this contact had on Northern California's environment. The two are intertwined. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to show you the territories of California natives prior to contact. These are the territories, and you can see that there are a lot of Native American nations. I don't call them tribes, I call them nations. All of these nations had economic, political, and social structures. So these are the nations. Of course, the remnants claim their homelands here, but things have changed a lot, and I'm going to talk about why they changed. Okay, let's look at the population numbers real quick. Prior to contact, scholars estimate that there were probably about 350,000, low number in California. I have concluded that there were probably more, close to 1 million, because we know that disease swept through. We know that there were massive killings. We know the mission system had a really dramatic effect on Native Americans. So prior to contact, between 350,000 and 1 million. In 1850, that number dropped to approximately 150,000. Okay. The reason for this is what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to come back to that number. In 1870, it dropped to 30,000. And by 1900, there were less than 20,000 Native American Californians recorded. Okay? The gold rush and the subsequent destruction of California's environment dramatically changed Native American lives and almost destroyed traditions, ceremonies, social and economic systems, and subsistence. So that number that you see, the 150,000, that number is a result of the mission system. The drop between 1850 and 1870 was due to the gold rush and what happened with the gold rush. Sense of place, sense of self, and spiritual awareness were found in the landscape. Manifestations of all that happened in the spirit world were reflected in the hills, mountains, rocks, rivers, lakes, and flora and fauna that make up native lands. These are pictures of Feather River. I put these up to show you, these are current pictures of Feather River, just the beauty, the natural beauty of what we have in California. But I also want you to understand that Native Americans use their environment, this environment, to live. And they continue to practice their traditions and use the environment. In all Native American myths and legends, animals known to the area, including worms and snakes, beetles and ticks, waterfowl and eagles, bears and skunks, and let's not forget the ultimate trickster coyote, are present in many Native American stories. Similarly, natural occurrences and weather are explained and explain how place and space emerged and grew, how natives utilized space. This is Tule Lake. Tule Lake once was a huge lake up in northeastern California, and basically what happened when the gold rush hit is they started draining that lake. Because if you've ever been to the northeastern corner of California, it's very dry, it's arid, and when farmers started coming in, they needed a water source. When ranchers came in, they needed somewhere where their cattle could go. And so this lake slowly receded. This is, by the way, the center of the Modoc universe. The Modoc people lived in this area. I want you to consider the words of Modoc Peter Scochin, who lived on the Klamath Reservation in Oregon. The Modocs were removed, the government actually removed them to Oregon from California in the 1860s after the Treaty of 1864 was signed. There were some problems that eventually led to war, though. But consider his words. We were told, these mountains, these rivers, hear what you say, and if you are mean, they will punish you. Similarly, Patricia James Easterla, who was a descendant of Shack Nasty Jim, that's what they called him, Shack Nasty Jim, who was a participant in the Modoc War of 1872 to 73, also stated something similar. The Modocs' harsh environment created not only a theological base, but a whole ethical and economic system that is different to comprehend when viewed without an understanding of the Modocs' age-old interaction with the environment. I would argue that this statement can be applied to all Native Americans and how they viewed the land in North America, Central America, and South America. That there's no difference in how they lived their lives, the sacredness of the land, and what they took from the land and how they took it. This is, you probably are familiar with this. This is Yosemite. And I have 3 pictures here. One is of Lucy Tillis, who was a basket maker. She was half Miwok, half Pomo. And she would go to Yosemite with her family, and they would make baskets. The top picture is a beautiful picture of Yosemite. And the bottom picture is the current picture of the present day Miwok village. Okay, so tourists can go in and see the Miwok village. Okay, so this is just a beautiful place. Luckily, when Theodore Roosevelt established the national park system, Yosemite was part of that, and so it was preserved. Most other California places were not preserved that Native Americans utilized. Okay, I also, in this picture, I know it's very small, but I love the basket. Look at the basket. It's just amazing, and that the materials from that basket came from what we see in the upper picture. They utilize their environment that way. Many critical issues emerge in the examination of California Native women's lives as they saw their sacred spaces targeted for extraction of resources. First, the development of Indian-white relations in Northern California grew as a result of different worldviews. By the middle of the 19th century, United States citizens and their government believed that their destiny was to inhabit and settle the entire span of the geographical area that is now the United States. This is the idea of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny became the justification for the removal or extermination of native inhabitants of the newly acquired area. California was one of the only states that actually had an extermination policy of Native Americans. An extermination policy where they actually paid militias to go and kill, or militias would go out and kill Native Americans, and they would bring scalps or heads in, and they would get paid for them. 25 cents a scalp, $5 a head. Okay. It was right after the gold rush. Or the gold rush really took off in 1850, and what we see is the massive dispossession. I'm going to get to that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So let me find my place again, and we'll go. Okay. The firm belief that manifest destiny was the United States' ultimate destiny, if I can be redundant, really did impact Native lives in several different ways. Native reactions to United States Indian policy and manifest destiny and their treatment by U.S. citizens evolved as a result of Native connections to the land and their relationship with their environment. Indeed, this culture clash centered on differing perspectives of the environment, of social and cultural structures, and of gender relations. The second issue had a direct bearing on the first issue. It determined how all Native American peoples would navigate their changing worlds, including gender relations and utilization of sacred space. California Native women's collective experiences determined the historical patterns that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. Changes in the environment had a direct impact on Native subsistence and subsistence patterns. A direct correlation between damage to the environment and the economic well-being of Native peoples is really clear. It becomes clear in the historical record. The westward movement and the ensuing gold rush drastically changed the cultural and physical landscape of women's lives in homelands. They had to negotiate how to survive as their homes, subsistence patterns, and families were overrun and eventually came under attack. As the economic base of Native Americans disappeared, these women had to contend with a new system that offered them little in terms of subsistence. Their new livelihoods included domestic service, prostitution, and agricultural pursuits for non-Indians. Between 1848 and 1864, United States officials recognized the growing friction between Native Americans and non-Indians. Commissioner of Indian Affairs William Dole stated the case in his 1862 report. According to Dole, quote, all or nearly so of the fertile valleys were seized. The mountain gulches and ravines were filled with miners. Without the slightest recognition of Indians' rights, they were dispossessed of their homes, their hunting grounds, their fisheries, and to a great extent, the production of the earth. Natives divided the tending of the earth among men and women. By the 1860s, both women and men could hardly fulfill obligations to produce food and necessities for living. This was a direct result of the gold rush. Disruption of the ecological base on which they depended upset community life and cultural and economic stability. Worse yet, the violent nature of the new arrivals and the complete disregard for Native lives placed women in a vulnerable position that directly impacted family, reproduction, and gender relations. Within this context, California Native women generally had little choice as the horrific events unfolded in the middle of the 19th century. In Indian Survival on the California Frontier, Albert Hurtado clearly presented the limited options for women during and immediately after the gold rush. Economic changes brought changes in subsistence patterns, in cultural norms, in family structures. More importantly, we see the growth of violence against Indians. Indian women in particular suffered from physical as well as sexual violence. Rape was common. According to Hurtado, quote, among most California Indians, however, the 1860 census shows a clear trend. In virtually every age cohort in every county, there were substantially fewer women than men. Indian women left tribal society and joined white households as servants and wives, but not in large numbers. All Indians were at risk during the tumultuous 1850s, but women's chances for survival were measurably worse than men's. Brutal assaults, deadly diseases, and general privation killed women and left their communities' reproductive potential in doubt, end quote. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, California Native peoples had to contend with non-Indians, mostly men, because the California gold rush brought mainly single men. They wanted to get their fortunes and go home, marry their sweethearts at home. Most of them stayed, but they were mostly men. Women did not have a lot of options. Non-Native women didn't have a lot of options either. Mostly men, invading their territories, committing violence against them, including sexual assault and rape, destroying Native economic and social structures, and dispossessing them of their ancestral homes. Intertwined with all of these is the direct negative impact on the environment. Men and women had to find ways to protect their families and maintain their livelihoods. Women adjusted, but they found it difficult to continue traditions under such difficult circumstances. And I'm going to go through a series of slides right now to show you the devastation. And this isn't just the devastation on Native Americans. It's on California. This is clear cutting of redwoods. This is in the 19th century, the 1800s. Imagine if you're a Native American and you've been living in this environment, and all of a sudden, if you're drawn into a town for work, this is what you see. We live in redwoods right now. And the clear cutting of redwoods started in the 19th century. And we see the really killing of these thousands of year old trees. And this is just some examples of the big trees and how it started changing the environment. People came in droves. And when the economy changed, so did the harvesting of resources. Where Native Americans were tending the earth, this was a wholesale destruction of the earth. And then we start getting into technology and what technology starts to do. Hydraulic mining could clear the face of a mountain. And Native Americans did not have any say in any of this. Okay, so I think that's the saddest part, almost. This discontinuity continued well into the 20th century. During the Progressive Era, pressure on Indian communities to assimilate also undermined family and community patterns. In response, Native peoples had to make choices dependent on circumstances that forced them to accept or reject the dominant society's expectations of them. The story that emerges in the first 4 decades of the 20th century indicate that Natives still did not have much control over their economic stability other than working for non-Indians. Women, however, did manage to bring in funds through various other means. So this woman, this was taken in the early 1900s, and you can see she's wearing the traditional conical basket on her back, which indicates that she's gathering. I'm not exactly sure what she's gathering, but she's gathering something. But seeing this was very unusual, seeing something like this, going back to the traditional ways, because now Native Americans are targeted for assimilation. They always have been, but in California, because of the destruction of the environment, Native Americans had to figure out a way to survive. and sometimes assimilation was it. The fascination with Indian cultures and the dominant society's calling to preserve them created a market for baskets, a skill that Indian women have maintained to the present day. And I want to show you. Edward Curtis was a photographer, and he went around taking photographs of different Native American nations. This photograph is actually of a Hoopa doctor. He did not include a name, which is very unfortunate, but she was quoted as saying, "The mountains are where I get my information to treat people. If you ruin my spiritual place, how will I take care of my people as a doctor?" So there's a direct correlation between the health of the people and the health of the environment. We also see this pattern emerging in Greg Sarris's biography of Mabel Mckay. She's the last dreamer of the Pomo. I don't know if you've heard of Mabel Mckay, but she's the last dreamer. I'm going to go ahead and go to her slide, and then I'll come back to the other slide. This is a picture of Mabel Mckay. She was actually featured in a news article in 1934, and then Greg Sarris wrote an autobiography of her, and this is a picture of her in her later life weaving a basket. Mabel Mckay was a sickly child who often accompanied her grandmother, Sarah Taylor, who worked for non-Indians. Sarris makes clear Sarah Taylor's important role as a laborer for whites in the early 1900s, around 1914. When she walked into town last spring after a 5-month stay in Cortina, the white folks asked her back. They asked her back to her position. They let go the Indian help they had hired to replace her. "Old Sarah the best," they said, which is what she requested at the end of each day's work as they dropped a coin into her apron and handed her a loaf of bread, sometimes a box of crackers, for the sick girl, Mrs. Mabel Mckay, at her side. "Old Sarah the best." It was about the only English she knew. So it's Sarah saying she was the best. That's why they brought her back. Okay. So she managed to bring in food for her family. She also managed to take care of her sick granddaughter. And her granddaughter wasn't sick. That's how people looked at the little girl, but she was a dreamer. She was starting her dreaming. And that's what happened throughout her life. Okay. I have a time limit. In his annual report of 1937, California Superintendent of Indian Affairs Roy Nash sent a detailed report to Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Collier outlining the conditions of California Indians. Included in this report were population numbers, showing a marked decline in population from 1890 to 1936. One category in particular caught my eye. As I read through this report, a category labeled Arts and Crafts stated, quote, "The old Indian arts and crafts have all but disappeared." Nash clearly believed that assimilation was the only course that California indigenous people could take. He continued, quote, "The Pomos once made the finest baskets in the world. 5 old women are about all working at it today, which leaves less than that number of young women learning to carry on. As an economic asset, Indian arts and crafts are dead." However, as he rang the death knell of Indian cultures, basketry in particular actually was being sought after. California baskets were being sought after. The reality of basket making and the economic condition of California Indian women belies Nash's words. The trade in baskets clearly suggests that California Indian women's basket weaving skills were in high demand. John D. Keeley fostered the sale, he's a superintendent, the sale of baskets in the late 1920s. In February of 1928, the Mission Product Company, upon the recommendation of E.B. Merritt, Assistant Commissioner of the Washington Office of Indian Affairs, requested the production of 25,000 baskets at 30 cents a piece. 30 cents a piece. Keeley basically said, no, it takes time, it takes effort. So if you want these baskets and made in the number that you want them made, it's going to be between $2.50 and $10 per basket. And it never happened because it takes too much time, and the spirituality that goes into the baskets really wasn't an assembly line thing that took place. Nash's report is certainly an indication of the common perception among non-Indians during the early 20th century that sooner than later, all Indians would be assimilated or dead. As events unfolded in the mid-19th century, it seemed as if the conclusion would be borne out as the population continued to decline. What history tells us is that regardless of this violent history, the indigenous people have survived, passed down their traditions, and retained their identities as viable political and social nations. And I'm going to go through. Julia Parker probably is one of the most well-known basket weavers in California. She's Coast Miwok and Chiapomo. This is her in 1960. Notice who was at her side. A young girl. And this is Julia Parker at age 83 in 2011. Native Californians also put together a Basket Weavers Association. And it has quite a few people who are part of the association. And I wanted to read a little bit about the CIBA. CIBA also works with local, state, and federal agencies and lawmakers to increase access to gathering areas, reintroduce traditional resources to particular sites, limit the use of harmful pesticides, and raise awareness of weavers and Native California cultures. And the vision statement ends by doing all of the above in a manner which respects elders and Mother Earth. Okay, there's a whole list. I just wanted to put that there because I want you to understand that even though we have this very violent history, this very painful history, we still have Native Californians working with the land, and we see that in the production of baskets. Baskets are very spiritual. Mostly they come to the basket weavers in dreams, and they manifest the spirit, really the spirit of California Native peoples. And I'm going to close there, and I want to thank you very much for coming.